Welcome back to the Proverbs series, guys. For today's video specifically, I want to go to chapter 15, verse 16, which reads like this. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble with it. Man, that is profound. But the reason I wanted to look at this verse in particular is because I feel like if you were to ask most people whether they would rather have a lot of money with significant stress attached to it or a modest life with peace, most people would say the modest life in theory. But watch how people actually spend their time, what they sacrifice their health for, what they neglect their relationships and their faith to pursue, and a very different answer emerges. In practice, the overwhelming majority of us are living as though more is always better, as though the accumulation of wealth and comfort is a primary goal worth organizing our lives around. But Proverbs 15:16 here does not just say that peace is nice to have alongside prosperity. It says a little with the fear of the Lord is actually better than great treasure with trouble. That is a comparative claim about objective value, not just personal preference. And so Solomon is not telling us what feels good. He's telling us what is actually worth more when you measure it correctly. And I think that's really worth taking into consideration coming from King Solomon. For context, brother was wealthy. Brother was him. And he is saying, even he, in his status that we will never attain as normal, regular humans, most of us, is still saying it's better to have a little with the fear of the Lord. And so that is a harder claim to sit with than it sounds, I understand, right? Because most of us have been shaped by a world that measures value almost exclusively in terms of accumulation. But Proverbs 15:16 steps directly into that assumption and challenges it at its root. And so let's break down the verse now. Better is a little with the fear of the Lord. The structure of this verse belongs to a category of Proverbs known as a better than saying, and there are several of them clustered in chapters 15 and 16, which we'll visit in the next few videos. But they all follow the same logic. Take two things that the world would rank in an obvious order, then reorder them based on a deeper principle. And so the genre itself is designed to disrupt our default assumptions about what constitutes a good outcome. A little here is deliberately unspecified. Solomon does not say a little of what, right? Not a little money or a little food or a little comfort specifically, just a little. But that vagueness is intentional. He's describing a general condition of modest means, a life that does not have abundance by conventional standards. There is no attempt to make the little sound romantically appealing or spiritually superior on his own terms, because it simply is what it is, not much. And what transforms the little is what accompanies it, the fear of the Lord. Because we established back in Proverbs 1:7, right, that the fear of the Lord is not terror, but the posture of reverence and awe, the orientation of a heart that genuinely acknowledges God as God. So it is a foundational disposition of wisdom. And here Solomon is saying that when we fear when the fear of the Lord accompanies a modest life, it transforms the value of that life in a way that no amount of wealth can replicate. And this is the clarification the verse needs the most, because it will be easy to read it as a romanticization of poverty, right? As if Solomon is saying that having less money is intrinsically more godly. That is not the claim here, because Solomon was a man of God. He had wealth. David was a man of God. He had wealth. So that is not the claim. The fear of the Lord is what makes the little better, not the littleness itself. Because a life of modest means without the fear of the Lord is just a hard life. It is the presence of God, the orientation toward him, the peace and meaning that flow from genuine relationship with him that makes the modest life genuinely better than the alternative being described here. In Psalm 37:16, we talked about him already. David echoes this directly. He says, better is the little that the righteous has than the abundance of many wicked. And so again, the comparison is not between having little and having much in purely financial terms. It is between a life rightly ordered towards God and a life that has accumulated wealth through means or with priorities that exclude him. And then I want to talk about the part of the verse that says, then great treasure and trouble with it. Because the second half of the verse is where Solomon gets specific about what the great treasure actually comes with. And he does not leave it ambiguous, because trouble, which in the Hebrew at the time, that it was a language that they were using to write this, Mehuma, describes turmoil, confusion, panic, and disturbance. So it is the word used in even in Deuteronomy 7:23 for the confusion that God brings on Israel's enemies in battle. It is a strong word for genuinely destabilizing kinds of distress, right? And so this is an important observation about the nature of great treasure in Solomon's framing here. Because he is not saying wealth always comes with trouble or that every wealthy person is miserable. No, he is describing a recognizable pattern that the pursuit and maintenance of great wealth frequently brings with it a category of anxiety, conflict, and a disturbance that the person with modest means simply does not have to carry. Think about what great treasure actually demands, right? It demands protection. It demands management. It generates envy and conflict. It produces complex decisions about allocation and investment. It attracts people whose interest in you is tied to what you have rather than who you are. And so it creates a pressure to maintain a standard of living that becomes its own kind of trap. None of these things are hypothetical. They are the consistent companions of significant wealth throughout human history. Even in Ecclesiastes 5:12, Solomon wrote that book as well, I'm pretty sure. It makes the same observation with a line that is almost jarring in its simplicity. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. That is crazy. The laborer with little sleeps well, and the wealthy person with much cannot. So the trouble that comes with great treasure is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is as quiet and as devastating as the inability to rest. The New Testament sharpens this further, by the way. In 1 Timothy 6:9-10, Paul writes, those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. The language of snares, ruin, destruction, and piercing is not mild. Paul is describing the trouble that Solomon identifies as the inseparable companion of great treasure pursued as an end in itself. And, you know, for myself personally, man, like, sometimes I fall into this trap where, like, I always say, like, oh man, you know, I don't care about wealth. I don't want to be rich. But then, like, I go to a nice hotel and I'm like, man, I kind of do want to have a lot of bread. You know what I mean? And then I start thinking of ways where how I can get it. Right. And then it just becomes just all-consuming trap, man, that happens. And so for me personally, I got to learn how to be content in whatever circumstances I find myself in. Shout out to Paul. That's Philippians 4 right there. But let's get practical for you guys here, right? Let's get applicable, because as I always say in my videos, I truly believe that is where knowledge turns into action, and it is one of the most crucial parts, one of the most critical parts of our Christian walk. And so the first thing is to reorder what we are actually optimizing our lives for. Because most of us are making daily decisions about how we spend our time, what we sacrifice for career advancement, how much of our margin we give to God and others, based on an implicit assumption that more financial security equals a better life. But Proverbs 15:16 here asks us to honestly examine whether that assumption is actually producing the life we want, or whether we are accumulating treasure and trouble simultaneously without noticing the second part of the package. And so practically, this might mean evaluating an opportunity not just by what it pays, but by what it costs in terms of peace, presence, and the fear of the Lord. The math on those decisions looks a lot different when we include the trouble column within. The second thing is to cultivate contentment. That's what I mentioned that earlier, as an active spiritual discipline, not a passive personality trait, right? Because the person with little and the fear of the Lord does not arrive at contentment accidentally, right? Paul makes this explicit in Philippians 4:11. I just said this, but I'm just going to read it verbatim here. I have learned in whatever situation I am in to be content. Learned, right? Contentment is not a temperament some people are just born with, right? To a certain extent, maybe, but it is a skill that is developed through practice. So practically, this means deliberately training ourselves to find genuine sufficiency in what we currently have, to thank God specifically for the modest provisions in our life, rather than treating them as a baseline to improve upon, and to resist the constant cultural message that the next level of financial comfort is the one that will finally produce the peace we are looking for. So the fear of the Lord is the foundation of that contentment, because it grounds our security in something that does not fluctuate with our bank balance. And then the third thing is to honestly evaluate the trouble that our current pursuits are generating. This application is perhaps the most urgent. If we are honest, right, if we're being completely honest, most of us can identify areas of our financial or professional life where the pursuit of having more is causing the exact kind of trouble Solomon describes: anxiety, relational strain, compromised integrity, or the quiet erosion of our walk with Christ. And so the question Proverbs 15:16 asks is not whether we should have ambition or pursue financial stability. It is whether the specific trouble our current pursuits are generating is worth what we are getting in return. Because sometimes the honest answer is that we have been so focused on the great treasure appeal that we have not been keeping an accurate account of the trouble that comes with it. So let me just give some closing thoughts here. This verse, Proverbs 15:16, is not a verse about settling for less. It is a verse about seeing clearly. It is Solomon, the wealthiest man of his freaking era, telling us from firsthand experience that the math on great treasure looks different once you account for everything that comes with it. The little with the fear of the Lord is not a consolation prize for people who could not achieve more. It is a genuinely better outcome than the alternative, measured not by conventional standards, but by the only standard that actually holds up under scrutiny. So we got to remember, guys, always, that peace is worth more than prosperity. The fear of the Lord is worth more than a full treasury. And a life that has both God and contentment, even without much else, is richer than most people with great treasure will ever feel.